What if I told you that the most dangerous thing in the American wilderness isn't a bear, isn't a mountain lion, and isn't the weather? What if the most dangerous thing out there is a person? Tonight, 3 hunters, 3 forests, 3 encounters that changed their lives forever. You've been warned. There's something about the wilderness that strips you bare. No cell towers, no neighbors. No one who would hear you if you screamed. When hunters head deep into the woods, they accept a certain degree of risk. The uneven terrain, the unpredictable weather, the occasional run-in with a bear or a coyote. But what they never expect, what no training manual ever prepares them for, is human danger lurking between the trees. Today, I'm sharing 3 stories submitted directly to me by real people across America. These aren't urban legends. These aren't campfire myths. These are first-hand accounts of hunters who walked into the woods perfectly ordinary and came back permanently changed. Before we begin, I want to warn you. These stories are not for the faint of heart. Once you start reading, you will not be able to stop. And when you finish, you may never look at a quiet stretch of forest the same way again. Let's begin. The man behind the tree. I've been hunting since before I could properly read a compass. My father started taking me out into the Smoky Mountain foothills when I was barely old enough to lace my own boots. Every early Saturday morning, rain or shine, we'd be up before sunrise, thermoses full of black coffee, boots crunching through the frost. It wasn't just about the hunt. It was about the silence. It was about learning to be patient in a world that never stopped moving. It was about becoming the kind of man who could sit still with himself. So when my son Caleb turned 10 years old, I didn't hesitate for a single second. It was time. The Aldridge men have always passed the tradition down. My grandfather passed it to my father. My father passed it to me. And now, standing in my garage at 4:30 in the morning, while Caleb rubbed sleep from his eyes and tried to look excited, I felt something I can only describe as a deep, full-chest kind of pride. I handed him an orange safety vest 3 sizes too big. He looked ridiculous. He looked perfect. We loaded the truck and drove 45 minutes into the national forest, not the touristy section near the highway, where leaf peepers park their SUVs and take pictures of deer from 50 yards away. I'm talking about the real part, the deep part, the part where the trails stop having names and the GPS signal gets patchy, and the only sounds are your own breathing and the occasional wind pushing through the canopy overhead. I carried both rifles until we found our spot, a natural clearing I'd been hunting for going on 12 years. Deer would pass through it like clockwork, following a creek line that curved through the bottom of a long, shallow ridge. I'd never once come out empty-handed from that spot. Not once. I set Caleb up with his rifle once we were settled in. I'd spent the previous 2 weeks teaching him the fundamentals, stance, breath control, trigger discipline, the whole curriculum. He wasn't going in blind. Still, I watched his hands carefully. Kids that age get excited. They move fast when they should move slow. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Then the waiting set in. Anyone who's hunted with a 10-year-old knows what happens next. The yawning starts. Then the shifting. Then the quiet, barely concealed sighs. Then the pointed looks that say, "Dad, nothing is happening." I watched Caleb's enthusiasm deflate like a slow leak in a tire. And I felt that familiar parental ache, the desperate wish that you could just will a deer into the clearing to give your kid his moment. I made a call. We were packing up and moving. Caleb perked up immediately. Kids his age need movement. They need to feel like something is happening. I figured we'd push a little deeper and try the creek bed, where I'd spotted fresh tracks 2 weeks earlier. We started walking. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not deer footsteps. Not squirrel in the leaves footsteps. These were deliberate, measured. The footsteps of something walking upright on two legs at a slow and careful pace about 40 yards to our east. I stopped cold. I put my arm out in front of Caleb without saying a word and motioned for him to raise his rifle. He did, and I could see the excitement flash back across his face. He thought it was a deer, maybe a buck, maybe the moment he'd been waiting for all morning. Then a head appeared from behind a tree, not a deer's head, a man's head. I pushed Caleb's rifle barrel down fast, maybe a little too roughly, and he looked up at me confused. I gave a quick, awkward wave in the direction of the man, the kind of apologetic wave that says, "Sorry, wrong target, carry on." The man's head disappeared back behind the tree, and that was when something cold settled in my stomach, because in the half-second I'd had to look at him, this man, this stranger, alone, deep in the Tennessee backcountry on a Tuesday morning. Something about his face wasn't right. I couldn't name it immediately. The distance was too great, maybe 60 feet through patchy morning light. But there was something off in his features, something that made my brain want to look away. He wasn't in hunter's orange. He wasn't carrying any visible gear. He was just there, standing behind a tree in the middle of nowhere, watching us. I told myself it was nothing. Some local hiker, some off-trail wanderer, nothing to worry about. But I steered us away from him anyway. Quietly, calmly, like I was simply changing course rather than retreating. Caleb asked about the man almost immediately. "Who was that, Dad? Is he hunting too?" "I don't know, buddy," I told him honestly, "but I don't think we need to go find out." We walked for another 10 minutes and found a new spot near a fallen oak that had split a long time ago, creating a natural blind. I set Caleb up there and we sat quietly again, watching the tree line. Then Caleb said he was hungry. I was too, honestly. I'd been so focused on Caleb's experience that I'd forgotten to eat anything before we left. I pulled out the sandwiches I'd packed, standard issue, turkey with a yellow mustard, and we ate in silence. That's when the footsteps came back. Different direction this time. Closer. Caleb heard them too because he dropped the sandwich and grabbed his rifle before I could even react. I looked up and felt my heart plummet straight down through the floor of my chest. The same man. Different tree, but the same man. Or what I was now fairly sure was the same man, leaning around the bark about 30 yards away. Closer than before. Much closer. And now, in better light, with less distance between us, I could see his face more clearly. I'm not going to try to describe it. Some things are better left without a detailed accounting. What I'll say is this. His face looked wrong in a way that went beyond simple ugliness or deformity. It looked wrong in a way that made every animal instinct in my body light up at once. Get your son and leave. I told Caleb to stay put and started walking toward the man. I don't know why. Maybe pride. Maybe some leftover territorial instinct. Maybe I just needed to do something instead of just standing there feeling afraid. I'd covered maybe half the distance when I stopped. What am I doing? My 10-year-old son was standing 30 yards behind me in the middle of a Tennessee forest, and I was walking toward a stranger with a wrong face. I turned around and went back to Caleb. "We're leaving," I said, just like that. No explanation. We started back toward the truck. Not running. I didn't want to frighten Caleb any more than I had to. But moving with purpose. I kept him slightly ahead of me, just a step or two, where I could see him, but also put myself between him and whatever might be behind us. I was mentally counting every sound, waiting for a twig snap, a leaf crunch, anything. It came about 4 minutes into our walk, a single branch snap, behind us, maybe 20 feet back. I nudged Caleb forward, keep going, don't stop, and turned around. The man was right there, closer than I'd realized, standing in the open this time, not hiding behind anything, just standing, watching us go. Something broke inside me. I don't know how else to describe it. Some threshold got crossed. I started moving toward him fast, not quite running, but close, aggressive. The kind of walk that says I am done being patient with you. He stepped back behind a tree at about 30 feet out, and then I heard a heavy, wet thud, the sound of something dense and soft dropping onto the ground. I had my rifle up, safety off, walking forward. I didn't say a word. I don't know why I didn't say anything. I just walked up to that tree, step by step, until I was close enough to see around it. He was gone. But on the ground, face down in the leaf litter, I can't fully explain what happened to me in that moment. It was like the world got very small and very quiet, all at once, like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were showing it, and just shut certain things down to protect me. There was a human head on the ground in front of me, no body, no blood trail leading away from it, just a head, resting face first in the dead leaves, with no explanation for how it got there, or who it belonged to. I didn't look up. I didn't look around the tree. I didn't stay 1 second longer than I had to. I ran. I ran back to Caleb, grabbed his hand, and told him to run too. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he could hear something in my voice. We hit the tree line at the edge of the forest at a dead sprint and didn't stop until we reached the truck. I drove home with both hands locked on the steering wheel, checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights on and a rifle across my lap until morning came. My wife found me there at 6 a.m., and I told her everything. She told me something I hadn't heard yet. 2 hunters had gone missing from the same forest over the previous 3 weeks. Local story. Didn't make national news. But locally, people knew. I called the sheriff's department as soon as they opened. I gave my statement. I showed them on a map where it had happened. I don't know if they ever found anything. I don't know if they caught whoever, or whatever, was out there. What I do know is this. I've gone back out hunting since then. I had to. The woods are part of me, and I refuse to let fear take that away. But I never go alone, and I never, ever go back to that clearing. There's a particular kind of morning that exists only in the mountains of East Tennessee in late autumn, the kind where the sky hasn't fully decided whether it wants to be dark or light, where the temperature is sitting right at the edge of freezing without quite committing to it, where the dried leaves under your boots make a sound, like crumpling paper with every step you take, the kind of morning where your breath clouds out ahead of you in small white puffs and disappears, and the whole world smells like cold earth and pine resin and something indefinably ancient. I grew up in those mornings. My father didn't teach me to hunt in any formal sense. He just took me with him from the time I was old enough to keep quiet and walk without falling. He believed that the best education happened through presence, that you learned by being there, in the thing itself, not by being told about it in advance. He was right. By the time I was 12, I could read a deer trail in soft ground better than most grown men, could tell you which way the wind was running without checking the indicator, could sit absolutely still in a blind for 3 hours without my mind wandering too far from the task at hand. I owe him everything I know about patience. So when my son Caleb turned 10, I knew it was time. The night before our first hunt, I sat in the kitchen after Caleb had gone to bed, and I laid out everything we'd need. 2 rifles, both checked and cleaned, 2 pairs of binoculars, orange vests. Caleb's was oversized because I'd bought up a size, figuring he'd grow into it. Snacks, turkey sandwiches, 2 bags of trail mix, a thermos each of hot chocolate, his, and black coffee, mine. Compass, first aid kit. The phone I'd turned to silent the moment we hit the tree line. I felt something that night that's hard to name. Pride, yes, but something more complicated than that. Something like the awareness of a circle closing. My father standing in a cold forest decades ago, watching a small version of me take my first steps into the wilderness. And now here I was, at the pivot point, becoming the older generation in the relay. We were on the road by 4:15 a.m. Caleb was in the passenger seat in his orange vest, eyes half open, holding his hot chocolate in both hands. He asked me, somewhere on the dark county highway, with no other headlights visible, whether I'd ever been scared in the woods. Sure, I said. Of what? I thought about it honestly. Of messing up, I said finally, of getting turned around and not knowing where I was, of making a mistake with the gun. He seemed to think that was a reasonable answer. I did not tell him at 4:30 in the morning on his first hunting trip that by the time the sun was fully up, I would have a completely different answer to that question. I parked at the edge of a gravel pullout I'd been using for 12 years, on a stretch of mountain road that had no address and barely showed up on maps. We geared up in the headlights, and then I killed them. And for a moment we stood in a darkness that felt almost physical, total and textured, pressing in from all sides. Then my eyes adjusted and the forest came back in silhouette against a lighter sky. We started walking. I carried both rifles until we reached our spot, the clearing I'd been working for over a decade, tucked into the elbow of a creek bend where 2 ridges met and deer moved through on something close to a schedule. I could have taken Caleb to the elevated blind I'd built deeper in the property, but that felt like cheating, somehow. Too comfortable, too removed from what hunting actually was. And I wanted him to feel the ground under his boots and the air on his face, and the slow weight of waiting. I set him up with his rifle when we were in position. I'd spent 2 weeks running him through the basics in the backyard: stance, breath, trigger control, the cardinal rules of muzzle discipline. So he wasn't going in cold. He knew what he was holding and why it demanded respect. For the first 45 minutes, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. The sky lightened. The birds started up. A squirrel moved through the canopy somewhere above and to our right. We were still and quiet, and I felt for a little while that deep satisfaction that hunting gives you when it's working right. The feeling of being genuinely present in a place, not scrolling through it or photographing it or narrating it, just in it. Then Caleb yawned for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. I understood. I'd been 10 years old once. 45 minutes of sitting still in cold air was an eternity at that age. I watched him shift his weight and sigh through his nose and look at me with an expression that said, "I love you, but this is taking forever." I made the call. We'd move. Push a little deeper. Find the spot near the creek bottom where I'd seen tracks 2 weeks earlier. "Are we going somewhere else?" Caleb whispered. "Yeah," I told him. "Better spot." He straightened up immediately. This is one of the most reliable things about 10-year-old boys. The promise of movement transforms them. He went from slumping to alert in about 3 seconds, and I felt the warmth of that again. That simple parental pleasure of giving your kid something to anticipate. We packed up quietly and started walking southeast toward the creek. I heard the footsteps within 2 minutes of moving. The woods produce a constant background of sound, rustling, creaking, the irregular drip of condensation from high branches. And within that background, your brain is always running a low-level pattern recognition process, sorting sounds into categories: normal, animal, weather, vegetation. The footsteps I heard now didn't sort into any of those categories. They were deliberate, bipedal, paced like a person who was moving carefully, trying to place each foot with intention. Coming from the east, maybe 40 yards out, roughly parallel to our own direction of travel. I stopped walking instantly. My arm went out in front of Caleb without a word, a gesture he understood immediately because we drilled what it meant. He stopped. I put my finger to my lips. He nodded. I motioned for him to raise his rifle. He did, and I could see the excitement reconfigure his entire face, that flash of focused alertness that I'd been hoping for all morning. He thought we'd found a deer, maybe a buck, the moment he'd been waiting for. I was already scanning the tree line to the east when the man's head appeared from behind a pine tree about 60 feet away. I pushed Caleb's barrel down immediately, firmly, no hesitation, and he looked up at me with an expression that moved through confusion, disappointment, and then a faint shadow of something he probably couldn't name yet. I raised a hand toward the stranger in an awkward approximation of a wave. "Sorry, thought you might be a deer." The man's head pulled back behind the tree. He didn't wave back. Didn't step out from behind the tree. Didn't call out. Just disappeared as suddenly as he'd appeared. And I stood there in the cold morning forest with my 10-year-old son and tried to process what I'd just seen. He wasn't in Orange. That was the first thing. Any hunter in this state who isn't in Orange is either careless or has a specific reason not to be visible. He had no visible gear, no pack, no rifle, nothing hanging from his belt. He was dressed, as far as I could tell, in ordinary clothing. Dark colors, not camouflage, just dark. And his face. In the half-second I'd had to look at him, in the pale, flat light of an overcast Tennessee morning, there was something about his face that I keep coming back to even now and still can't adequately describe. It wasn't disfigurement, exactly. It wasn't injury. It was more like the proportions were subtly wrong in a way that my brain kept trying to correct and couldn't. Like a picture hung slightly crooked, that you can't stop noticing even when you're trying to look at something else. I steered us away from him. No announcement, no explanation to Caleb. Just a gradual, deliberate change of direction, angling us northwest, away from wherever he was. Caleb asked about him within 30 seconds. "Who was that guy? Is he hunting too?" "Don't know," I said. "Let's just keep moving." He didn't have a gun. I noticed that. That's weird, right? "Let's keep moving, bud." We walked in silence for a while. I told myself I was being paranoid. Told myself there were 100 innocent reasons for a person to be in these woods without gear at 6:30 in the morning. Hikers. Birders. People who'd parked somewhere I didn't know about and were taking an early walk. People who had every right to be exactly where they were. By the time we found the fallen oak I'd been hoping to use as a natural blind, I'd almost convinced myself. We settled in. Caleb was eating trail mix before I could even set my rifle down. The morning was warming slightly, the overcast beginning to thin. Through the bare branches, I could see patches of pale blue sky starting to open up. I was getting genuinely hungry myself. I'd been too focused on logistics to eat before we left. And when Caleb reminded me that I'd packed sandwiches, I pulled them out. Turkey and yellow mustard, the same thing my father used to pack. We ate in comfortable silence. I was about 3 bites in when the footsteps came back. Same deliberate quality. Same careful placement. But closer this time. Coming from the north. Working around toward us. Caleb dropped his sandwich and picked up his rifle in one smooth motion, some of that training actually sticking. And I looked up to see the same man peering from behind the broad trunk of a white oak maybe 30 yards away, closer than before. And now, with better light and less distance, I could see his face clearly. I'm not going to describe what I saw. I'm going to say that when I saw it, every rational thought in my head went very quiet, and a single clear animal instinct took over. Get your child away from this place. I told Caleb to stay put, and I started walking toward the man. I don't know what I intended to do. Confront him. Demand an explanation. Assert some kind of territorial authority. Something. Anything. Action feels better than frozen fear, and I was doing what most people do when they can't tolerate the feeling of helplessness. I was substituting aggression for clear thinking. I got about halfway there, and then I stopped. What was I doing? My son was standing behind me in the middle of a remote Tennessee forest. I had no backup, no plan, no idea who this person was or what they wanted. And I was walking toward them. I turned around and went back. Caleb could read my face well enough to know that something had changed. He didn't ask questions. I told him it was time to leave, and something in my voice closed off any argument. We started back toward the truck, unhurried but purposeful. I kept Caleb slightly ahead of me. 1 step, 2 steps, close enough that I could always see him, but with myself, positioned between him and whatever might be behind us. I counted every sound the forest made. I got to maybe 450 before the branch broke behind us. One clean snap, approximately 20 feet back and slightly to the right. I nudged Caleb forward. Keep going, don't stop, keep walking, and turned around in one motion. The man was there, in the open now, not hiding behind anything. Standing in the middle of the trail we'd just left, watching us go, maybe 50 feet back, something in me snapped. I started moving toward him, fast, not running, but the kind of purposeful, direct walk that says I am done. He retreated, stepped quickly back behind a pine tree when I got within about 30 feet of him. Then I heard the thud. Soft, heavy, the sound of something dense dropping onto ground covered with leaves. My rifle was up. I walked to the tree, slowly, each step deliberate and careful. He was gone, but on the ground in front of me, face down in the leaf litter, was... I can't. Even now, years later, I can't quite bring myself to write it out in plain language. I'll say this. It was human. It was a part of a person. And the fact of its presence in that forest under those specific circumstances told me everything I needed to know about who had been following us and what they were capable of. I ran. I grabbed Caleb's hand without slowing down and told him to run. And he ran. And we didn't stop until the tree line ended and the truck was in front of us and I could see the county road and another car. Any car. In the distance. I drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't tell Caleb what I'd seen. I told him we'd had an encounter and that we'd talk about it when we got home. That night, I sat awake in the living room until sunrise. In the morning, my wife told me she'd heard, third hand from a neighbor. The 2 local hunters had disappeared from this area over the past month. She didn't know the details. Just that they were gone. I called the sheriff's department when they opened. I gave them everything I could. Location, description as best I could provide it, timestamps, the location of what I'd found on the ground. I never heard definitive results from the investigation. I don't know if they found him or found the rest of what I'd seen, or whether any of it ever made sense in the context of the disappearances. I do know that I've been back to those woods many times since then, but I never go back to that creek bend, and I never go alone. Some doors, once you've looked through them, you can never fully close again. What came out of the dark, I want to be upfront about something before I start. I'm not much of a hunter. I wasn't raised in a hunting family. I didn't grow up learning to track or skin anything. And frankly, the whole idea of going into the woods to kill things had never appealed to me the way it seemed to appeal to everyone I knew in Montana. So when my buddy Ryan asked me for the fourth time if I wanted to join their annual elk hunting trip up near the Beartooth Plateau, I said no. When he asked the fifth time, I said yes. Mostly I just wanted to get out of the apartment. It had been a rough fall. New job, bad breakup, the usual. And the idea of spending 2 days in the mountains with no phone signal and no responsibilities had a certain appeal that had nothing to do with elk. The group was Ryan, his longtime hunting partner Derek, and a couple named Connor and Mia, who'd been coming on these trips for 3 years running. 5 of us total. We drove up in 2 trucks, Ryan's and Connor's, both loaded down with gear. 2 large tents, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, 2 days of food, water filtration, and enough rifles between them to outfit a small militia. Ryan handed me a hunting rifle as we were unloading. "I don't know what this is," I said. "It's a gun," he said. "Point the long part at the elk." He wasn't wrong. I spent most of the hike to our campsite, about 1.5 miles into the backcountry, staring at the rifle in my hands and trying to feel like someone who knew what they were doing. We set up camp in a flat, sheltered area near a creek bend. Good sight. Out of the wind, close to water with clear sight lines in 3 directions. Ryan knew what he was doing. I'll give him that. Here's the thing about hunting trips when you're not actually into hunting. You find yourself watching the people more than the landscape. Ryan was genuinely passionate, explaining everything in the kind of enthusiastic detail that could wear you down fast. I tried once to point out that maybe the non-stop talking would scare away any elk within a half-mile radius. He did not appreciate the observation, so I stayed quiet. Things were normal for maybe the first 2 hours of the hunt. Then we ran into them. 3 men, standing in the middle of a game trail like they owned it. I don't have a better way to describe them than this. They looked like they had been outside for years without stopping. Their clothes were some indeterminate color that might have started as denim or canvas, but had been so thoroughly stained and weathered that it had become its own category of gray. Their hair was long and matted and stuck to their faces in ways that suggested it had been a very long time since it had been washed. They were all large, not in a gym-built way, but in a I have spent my entire life doing physical labor in remote places way. They looked at us as we passed them, a slow, rotating look. One of them nodded, barely. Not a greeting exactly. More like an acknowledgement, like they were noting our passage through their territory. The 5 of us didn't say anything to each other until we were well past them, and then everyone started talking at once in hushed voices. "Who were those guys?" Mia said. "No idea," Derek said. "Ryan said they were probably just locals, off-grid types. Montana had plenty of them, nothing to worry about." But the way he said it, quickly like he was trying to convince himself as much as us, didn't exactly land as reassuring. Still, they didn't follow us. We made it through the rest of the afternoon without incident. Ryan got a deer, not an elk, but something, and the process of dragging it back to camp and processing it was exactly as unpleasant as I'd imagined. I watched about 8 seconds of the skinning process before I decided I needed to be on the other side of the camp. Ryan came prepared with everything, though, and by the time full dark fell, we had venison on the fire and the whole thing felt almost normal. Almost. We turned in at dark. 2 tents, one for Ryan, Derek, and me. One for Connor and Mia. Fire still going outside. Sky absolutely packed with stars. I have never been able to sleep in a sleeping bag. Something about the compression around my feet, the material against my face, the inability to roll fully onto my side. It just doesn't work for me. Ryan and Derek were out within 20 minutes. I was still awake an hour after that, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the fire pop outside. I was just starting to feel genuinely tired when I heard footsteps. Close. Right outside the tent. I opened my mouth to call out Connor's name. Maybe he and Mia had gotten up for something. And then I stopped. What if it's not Connor? I lay completely still. Slow my breathing down. Listen. A pause. Then the sound of a zipper. Our tent zipper starting at the top, pulling downward. I threw myself sideways onto my sleeping bag and let my eyes fall shut, forcing my face into the slack expression of someone dead asleep. The tent flap opened. I couldn't see anything through my eyelids, but I could feel the cold air come in, and I could hear, or maybe sense, something standing in the open door of the tent, looking in. Looking at the three of us. A long pause. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then the zipper pulled back up. I waited, heart pounding until the footsteps moved away, toward the other tent. And then I thought, that must have been Connor. He must have been checking if we were asleep. Why he'd do that, I could guess. Privacy in close camping quarters is a limited resource. I decided I'd give them 5 minutes before I crept over and scared the daylights out of them. A small revenge for all the hunting enthusiasm I'd endured. I gave it 5 minutes. I unzipped our tent and slipped out into the dark. Connor and Mia's tent was about 20 feet away. The fire had died to embers, barely enough to see by. I crept forward on the balls of my feet. Then I noticed their zipper was still down. Not part way. All the way. I stopped moving. The tent flap was hanging open, and as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see shapes inside the tent. Moving shapes. More than 2. I screamed. I didn't decide to scream. It just happened. The sound tore out of me before I'd processed what I was seeing, and it was loud. Louder than I'd ever screamed in my life. The full-body kind of scream that comes from pure animal fear. Ryan and Derek exploded out of our tent with their rifles. 2 figures came flying out of Connor and Mia's tent at a dead run, sprinting into the darkness of the tree line. And in the half-second, I had to see them before they disappeared. I recognized them. The matted hair, the stained clothing. 2 of the 3 men from the trail. Ryan and Derek fired rounds after them, not to hit them, I think, but to put distance between us and them, to make very clear what would happen if they came back. And then something happened that was worse, far worse than any of that. We turned around to look at our campsite, and they were there, not in the tree line, not running away. There, in the bushes immediately around our camp, pressed low, completely still. I couldn't tell how many. 4, 5, maybe more. Just shapes in the dark, crouching and watching. When the rifles went off, they scattered, all at once like a flock of startled birds, breaking in every direction, disappearing into the forest. We stood there in the clearing, in the dying ember light, listening to them go. Then we went to check on Connor and Mia. They were unconscious, both of them lying in the tent, breathing slowly but impossible to wake. We tried everything, calling their names, shaking their shoulders, nothing. Like someone had flipped a switch and turned them off. We figured it out eventually. They'd been drugged somehow. Injected with something while they slept. We couldn't know when it had happened. We couldn't know who done it while we were asleep in our own tent. We waited 32 of the longest minutes of my life for them to start coming around. When they finally did, groggy and confused and barely functional, we didn't even try to explain. We broke down both tents in the dark, loaded everything we could carry, and ran. I mean that literally. We ran. Through pitch-black forest, no trail. Just compass bearing toward the parking lot, stumbling over roots and slipping on loose rock. Ryan had a headlamp. I had nothing but the person in front of me to follow. When we finally hit the parking lot and I could see the trucks and the moonlight on the asphalt, I nearly cried. We never figured out who those men were. We filed a report with the county sheriff when we got back, but without names, without clear identification, without anything taken, at least that we could prove. There wasn't much to go on. To this day, I don't know what they intended to do. I only know that we were lucky, and I know this. I will never in my life be convinced to go camping in a remote area of Montana again. Some lessons only need to be taught once. Let me be honest about something up front. I am not someone who scares easily. I'm not saying that to sound tough. I'm saying it because it matters for context. I grew up in a part of Montana where everybody has a story about a bear encounter, or a winter survival situation, or a time the pickup broke down on a logging road 30 miles from the nearest town. Danger isn't abstract where I come from. It's something you budget for, prepare for, and then move past. You don't dwell on it. So when I tell you that what happened on that hunting trip in the Beartooth foothills was the most frightened I have ever been in my life, more frightened than I was when I rolled a snowmobile at 40 miles an hour on an icy trail, more frightened than I was the night my apartment caught fire and I had to drop from a second-story window, I want that context to land properly. I was genuinely and completely terrified. And I am not a man who says that easily. Ryan Hastings had been inviting me on this annual trip for 5 years. I'd said no every time, for a rotating cast of reasons: work, money, other plans, general disinterest in the sport. But that fall, I was in a place where saying yes to things felt necessary. New job that was grinding me down, relationship that had ended badly, the particular flatness that sets in when you've been in your own head too long. Ryan said, "Come to the mountains. You don't have to shoot anything. Just come." I said yes. The group was Ryan Derek Boyle, his hunting partner for going on 8 years, and a couple named Connor Walsh and Mia Sutherland who'd been part of this annual trip since it started. I'd met them both before at Ryan's various gatherings. They were easy, comfortable people, the kind of couple that travels well with other people. No drama, no overcrowding. We drove up in 2 trucks on a Thursday afternoon, hitting the trailhead at a parking lot that was completely empty when we arrived. Not unusual, Ryan said. This part of the plateau didn't get much traffic in late October. Most recreational users stuck to the front country. We were going somewhere that required actual commitment to reach. The hike in was 1.5 miles, loaded down with gear, gaining maybe 400 feet of elevation through mixed lodgepole and spruce. I was carrying a pack that weighed somewhere north of 40 pounds, and trying to look like this was not a problem. By the time we reached the campsite, I was winded enough that I was very grateful for the excuse to stop moving. Ryan had chosen the spot well, flat ground, sheltered from the prevailing wind by a natural rise to the west, close enough to a creek for water access, with a clear sightline in 3 directions. We had the tents up in under an hour and the fire going shortly after that. Ryan spent the first part of the evening running through hunting technique, projecting a level of enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting to share this information with a new audience for some time. He talked about wind direction, game sign, calling techniques for elk, the difference between a fresh track and an old one. I listened respectfully and tried to look interested. At one point, I made the observation, quietly I thought, that possibly the non-stop talking was audible for a significant distance in the still mountain air. Ryan's expression closed down in a very specific way. I shut up after that. We turned in within an hour of full dark, tents in a small cluster, fire banked enough to last most of the night. The sky at that elevation, away from any light pollution, was the kind of thing that makes you understand why ancient people built entire cosmologies around what they saw overhead. Stars you'd forgotten existed, in numbers that made the darkness between them seem like the exception, rather than the rule. I am, as I've mentioned, not a person who scares easily. But there was something about those three men on the trail that afternoon that I couldn't shake. We'd encountered them about an hour into the hunt. Three large men standing in the middle of a game trail as if they belonged there, which I suppose they might have, technically, but which felt profoundly wrong in context. There was no one else in this backcountry. The parking lot had been empty. We had seen no signs of any camp, no gear, no vehicles. These men had simply appeared, as if they'd grown up out of the ground. They were dirty in a way that suggested sustained outdoor living rather than a single day of exertion. Their clothes were past worn, past weathered, into some further stage of deterioration that I didn't have a word for. Long hair matted and hanging. Eyes that tracked our passage with a slow, careful attention that was neither friendly nor hostile, just watchful. One of them nodded as we went by, the slight inclination of a head, not a greeting, not an acknowledgement of shared humanity, more like the movement a predator makes when it clocks something and decides, for now, to let it pass. We discussed them afterward in hushed voices and arrived at a collective agreement that they were probably nothing. Off-grid locals. Montana had them. The state had corners that remained genuinely remote, genuinely beyond the reach of the ordinary world, and the people who chose to live in those corners sometimes looked like these men. We convinced ourselves. Mostly. Ryan killed a mule deer late in the afternoon, not an elk, but significant enough that he was satisfied, and we dragged it back to camp for dinner. He was organized and prepared in a way that impressed me despite myself, coming equipped with everything needed to process the animal and produce an actual meal from it. We ate around the fire when full dark had come, and the conversation mellowed into the comfortable, unhurried kind that only happens when you're tired and warm and away from everything that usually demands your attention. I felt, for a little while, like coming had been the right decision. Then we went to sleep. Ryan and Derek and I shared the larger tent. Connor and Mia had the second one, pitched about 20 feet from ours. I'd been warned that the sleeping bags were rated for temperatures lower than we were likely to see tonight. But rated for and comfortable in are two different things. And I spent the first hour after lights out fighting the particular misery of a sleeping bag that compresses in all the wrong places. Ryan and Derek were out quickly. I was still awake when the fire outside had died down to near silence, lying flat on my back and staring at the dark fabric above me, thinking about nothing in particular. That's when I heard footsteps outside the tent, one person, moving carefully. The footsteps had the quality of intentional quiet. Someone trying not to make noise, not quite succeeding. I started to say Connor's name, then stopped. What if it's not Connor? The thought arrived with perfect clarity and absolute calm, which is somehow more unsettling than panic. I lay still and listened. The footsteps circled slightly to the door of our tent, then the sound of the zipper, starting at the top, drawing slowly downward. I rolled sideways, pulled my face into the slack expression of sleep, and waited. Cold air came in, the sense of the door being open, something standing there, the particular quality of silence that comes when something is looking at you. 10 seconds, 15, 20. The zipper drew back up. The footsteps moved away toward Connor and Mia's tent. I lay there for a full minute, running calculations. Connor checking if we were asleep. Had to be. Coming from the other tent to check before he and Mia. I didn't complete the thought. The logic held well enough. 5 minutes, give them privacy, then go, give them a scare. A small repayment for all the hunting enthusiasm. I gave it 5 minutes. I unzipped the tent, slipped out into the cold, and moved toward their tent on the balls of my feet. 20 feet away, I stopped. Their zipper was still down, the full length of it hanging open. I could see movement inside the tent, shapes in the dark, but more shapes than two, and moving in a way that didn't match any innocent explanation I could generate. The scream came out of me before I decided to scream. Full volume, full body, the kind of sound that carries half a mile in still mountain air. Ryan and Derek were out of the tent before the echo had finished, rifles in hand, completely operational in a way that spoke to years of muscle memory. 2 figures exploded from Connor and Mia's tent and hit the tree line at a dead run. In the half second I had to see them, I recognized the way they moved, the size of them, the matted hair catching what little light there was, the men from the trail. Ryan and Derek fired, not to kill, I think, but to send a message, to make the darkness understand that this camp was defended. The reports cracked out across the mountain and rolled away into silence, and then we all turned around at the same moment, scanning the camp. They were there, not in the tree line, not 50 yards away, right there, in the bushes at the edge of our camp, crouching, still, watching. I couldn't count them. 4, maybe 6, maybe more. Just shapes in the dark, present in all the places I hadn't been looking. When they went all at once, a sudden collective movement like a flock of starlings changing direction, every shape in motion simultaneously, crashing away into the forest in different directions until the sound faded and we were alone in the firelight. We stood in the clearing for a long time without saying anything. Then we went to check on Connor and Mia. They were breathing. Both of them. That was the first thing, the important thing. Lying in the tent, slow breathing, completely unresponsive to their names, to touch, to anything. Not unconscious from a blow, not sleeping. Something else. Something that had been introduced from outside. We waited. There was nothing else to do. Running through that forest in the dark, with an unknown number of people in the trees around us, with 2 people who couldn't walk. Running wasn't a real option. 32 minutes. I timed them. When Mia started coming around, she didn't know where she was for almost a minute. When Connor followed about 4 minutes later, he couldn't answer simple questions for a while. Name, date, what he'd had for dinner. Whatever had been used on them was thorough. We didn't explain what had happened. We just moved. Broke down both tents in the dark, working in near silence. Distributed the load between those of us who could carry it. Ryan kept one hand on a rifle the entire time. I kept looking at the tree line every 30 seconds, waiting for shapes to reappear. Nothing came. We moved out on compass bearing, Ryan in front with the headlamp, Mia and Connor supported in the middle, Derek and I bringing up the rear. 1.5 miles of dark forest between us and the parking lot. Every twig snap made me flinch. When the tree line opened onto the parking lot and I could see the trucks, I almost sat down on the pavement. The police report were filed the next day produced, as far as I know, very little. No names, No identifications, no clear evidence of a specific crime beyond the trespassing we couldn't fully prove. Montana's remote areas don't give law enforcement a lot to work with. But I know what I saw, and I know what would have happened if I'd been able to fall asleep that night. Some things don't need an official conclusion to teach you everything you need to know. The sack in the dark. Before I tell you what happened, I need to tell you who I am. I've been hunting hogs on my family's land for going on 22 years. I was 12 years old the first time I climbed into the wooden tower my grandfather built behind the property line, and I've been doing it ever since. My grandfather built that tower from rough-cut lumber salvaged from an old barn. Over the years, I've reinforced it, weatherproofed it, replaced boards that rotted out, added a padded seat and a small storage shelf for gear. It's my spot, my sanctuary in a way. More hours of my life have passed in that tower than in most of the rooms of my house. I say all this because I want you to understand that I am not easily frightened in the woods. I know every sound the East Texas forest makes at night. I know the difference between a hog moving through brush and a deer, between a coyote and a bobcat, between a branch falling from dead weight and a branch knocked loose by something moving underneath it. The dark doesn't scare me. Animals don't scare me. I've been doing this long enough to be fluent in the language of nighttime wilderness. What happened that night was not something I was fluent in. It was late October, mild for East Texas, with a half moon that gave just enough ambient light to see the edges of shapes without giving you any real details. I was in the tower around 10 p.m., settled in, night vision scope on the rifle, watching the open stretch of scrub brush that runs along the back fence line. Hogs had been tearing up that section of land for weeks. You could see the damage in the daylight, whole sections of root systems excavated, fence posts destabilized, and I was there to reduce the population by a couple of animals. I was patient. I always am. That's the whole point of the tower. You let the night settle around you. You become part of it and you wait. The movement came about 40 minutes in. I raised the rifle, put my eye to the night vision scope and found the source. And then I just held absolutely still. Because it wasn't a hog, it was a man. He was moving across the far edge of the property, parallel to the fence line, maybe 80 yards out. Dressed all in black, dark sweatpants, dark sneakers, a black hoodie with the hood pulled up tight. He was walking with purpose, not stumbling, not wandering. This was deliberate movement. But that's not what made my blood go cold. He was dragging something behind him, a large bag. Duffel-shaped, maybe, or a heavy-duty contractor bag. It was hard to tell through the scope in the low light. But it was large enough that it required a two-handed grip to pull, large enough that it left a visible drag trail in the soft ground behind him, large enough to hold a person. I'm not a paranoid man. I don't jump to worst-case scenarios. I looked at what I was seeing and I tried, genuinely and in good faith, to come up with an innocent explanation. I couldn't. There is nothing that a person legitimately does on a stranger's private property at 10 o'clock at night, dressed all in black, dragging something that heavy, that couldn't wait until morning. I kept watching him through the scope. He was moving slower now. His head kept dropping, like he was checking the ground for something, or choosing his path carefully. Then he stopped completely, and he turned his head upward. Not toward any particular feature of the landscape. Not at the moon. Straight up, at a slight angle that put him looking, as far as I could tell, directly at the tower. My tower. The tower where I was sitting. I dropped below the wooden railing in one movement. Heart absolutely hammering. lying flat on the deck of the tower with my face pressed against the rough lumber. The darkness, I told myself, was on my side. There was no light source associated with the tower. Nothing to give away my position. He might have seen the silhouette of the structure, but that was just a hunting tower. Normal property equipment. He wouldn't necessarily know it was occupied. That's what I told myself. I lay there listening. The forest had gone quiet. No crickets, no owl calls, nothing. Just the light wind in the upper canopy and my own heartbeat. Then a sound I will never forget as long as I live. A boot connecting with the bottom rung of the ladder. The whole tower vibrated, just slightly. This structure has been standing for decades, and it doesn't move easily. But I felt it. One step, then a pause, another step. He was climbing. My mind was doing something I'd never experienced before. A kind of flat, controlled panic, where everything gets very clear and very terrible at the same time. I had a loaded rifle 6 inches from my right hand. I'd never pointed a weapon at a human being in my life. The prospect was almost more terrifying than the man on the ladder. Am I actually going to have to shoot someone tonight? A third step. A fourth. And then, nothing. A long pause. Long enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. And then, a sound of boots hitting ground, and the drag sound again moving away. He'd turned around. He was going. I gave it 10 full minutes before I moved. 10 minutes of lying flat, not making a sound, listening to the forest start to come back to life around me. When I finally raised my head above the railing, the far fence line was empty. Whatever he'd been doing, wherever he'd been going, he was gone. I should have stayed put. I know that now. I should have called the police from the tower and waited for them to arrive before I moved. That was the rational, correct, survivable choice. I didn't make the rational choice. I climbed down the ladder, turned on my pocket flashlight, a decision I immediately questioned, and started for the house at a fast walk. Behind me and to my left, I could hear nothing. Ahead of me, the lights of the back porch were visible through the trees. I had maybe 400 yards to go. I managed about 60 before I heard the footsteps, fast, getting faster, coming from directly behind me, crashing through dry leaves with complete abandon, the sound of someone who was no longer trying to be quiet. I looked back over my shoulder. He was right there, not 30 feet away. Closing the distance in a dead sprint, face still hidden by the shadow of the hood, arm reaching out toward me. I spun around and fired. The shot hit him in the shoulder. He stopped like he'd hit a wall. A sound came out of him. I won't describe it, but I won't forget it either. And in that fraction of a second, I turned and ran the rest of the way to the house. I hit the back door, locked it behind me, and called 911 before I even sat down. The police arrived in 14 minutes. I led them through the property with a flashlight, moving in a group, rifles out. We found the drag trail first, a long, unmistakable furrow in the soft East Texas earth, leading across the back section of the property to where the bag had been left behind when he ran. The bag the police seized, cataloged, and took away. I don't know the full details of what they found. They wouldn't tell me everything that night. Then we followed the blood trail, dark drops on pale leaf litter, curving around the back fence and into the tree line beyond the property boundary, maybe 200 yards out. He was hiding under a fallen pine, legs pulled up, pressing his jacket against his shoulder. He didn't run when we found him. He just looked up at the light. They arrested him on the spot. I found out later through the investigation that the man had been charged with the murder of a local business owner a Vietnamese immigrant named Lin Park who had run a small grocery store on the edge of the nearest town for 15 years. How the crime connected to my property, why he'd been on my land that night, what exactly was in that bag. Those details came out slowly over the following months, filtered through court proceedings I wasn't always party to. What I know is this: something terrible was already in motion that night. Something that would have been significantly worse if I hadn't been in that tower. I've been back out hunting since then. The tower is still standing. On clear nights when the moon is right and the hogs are moving, I still climb up and take my position and wait. But I keep my phone charged now, and I always tell someone where I'm going before I go. My grandfather built the tower when I was 9 years old. I remember standing at the base of it and watching him work. The methodical way he drove each nail. The way he checked every board before he trusted weight to it. The way he'd stop and look out at the property from whatever height he'd reached, like he was measuring the view against some internal standard. He didn't talk much when he worked. Neither did I. That was one of the things we had in common. When it was done, he let me climb it first. 22 years later, that tower is still standing. I've replaced most of the original lumber at one point or another. The treads on the ladder twice, the deck boards once, the railing twice. I've added things he didn't include: a padded seat, a small shelf for equipment, a cover for the sight window that can be lowered in heavy rain. It's my project, my responsibility, my place. I've sat in that tower on nights when the temperature dropped into the single digits and nights when the East Texas humidity made breathing feel like swimming. I've sat up there through thunderstorms, watching lightning split the pine canopy half a mile out. I've sat up there when I was sad, and when I was happy, and when I was just empty, needing to be somewhere that didn't require anything from me. That tower is the place I know best in the world, which is why what happened there stays with me the way it does, because it didn't happen somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere I could chalk up to the disorientation of strange terrain. It happened in the exact place where I've always felt most at home. Late October, mild night for that time of year, maybe 58 degrees at 10 p.m., which in East Texas in autumn is practically comfortable. Half moon, thin clouds moving through in loose formations, enough ambient light that the open scrub brush behind the fence line was visible as a grayish expanse rather than total darkness. Good night for hogs. They'd been tearing up the back half of the property for weeks, rooting up whole sections of ground, knocking over smaller trees, wrecking the deer feeder I'd put up 2 seasons ago. I was in the tower by 9:45, night vision scope attached, settled into that particular quality of patience that tower hunting requires. The kind that isn't waiting for something to happen patience, but rather a deeper, quieter state, a genuine stillness that you have to practice to reach. I watched the fence line, and I watched the brush. I listened. At 10:23, movement. Something crossing the property from the western boundary towards the back fence, moving through the scrub in a way that didn't match any animal's pattern. Too deliberate, too upright. I put my eye to the night vision scope, and the world through that lens went from routine to deeply wrong in about half a second. The figure was a man, adult male, moving at a purposeful walk. Dark clothing, black hoodie with the hood drawn up, dark pants, dark shoes. No reflective elements, no light source, nothing that would make him visible to anyone who wasn't looking through night vision. He was dragging something. A bag, long and heavy and wide, requiring both hands to move, leaving a visible trace in the soft ground behind him. The kind of bag that in any other context might suggest yard waste or camping gear. But this was not any other context. This was private land, in the dark, at 10:30 at night, with someone who was dressed specifically to avoid being seen. I watched him for about 90 seconds. I want to be clear about my mental state during those 90 seconds. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even exactly afraid yet. I was in a state of cold, careful assessment, the same state I get into when something unexpected happens with equipment in the field, or when a weather situation starts developing faster than forecast. Problem identification mode. Running through possibilities. What is this person doing on my property? Is there any innocent explanation? What do I do about it? The first question, I couldn't figure out an answer. The second question, genuinely no. The third question, call the police and stay in the tower. That was the correct answer. That was the rational, defensible, survivable answer. I was reaching for my phone to do exactly that when he stopped. His head dropped, scanning the ground, I thought, and then slowly, tilted upward, and kept going, up at an angle that put him looking directly at the tower. For 3 full seconds, I was still visible above the railing, staring back at him through the scope. 3 seconds of full exposure. Then my body made the decision before my conscious mind caught up, and I was flat on the deck, face down, heart rate going from measured to absolutely unhinged in approximately 1 beat. Did he see me? I lay completely still. The wooden deck of the tower was solid under my cheek, familiar grain, familiar smell of weathered pine. And I focused on that familiarity while my brain worked through the question. The tower had no light source. The moon was partly obscured. At 80 yards with the naked eye, a motionless shape above a wooden railing might register as structural rather than human. Might. I waited. The forest, which had been producing the usual low background of night sounds, went quiet. No crickets, no distant tree frogs, nothing. Just silence. And then a boot hit the bottom rung of the ladder. The tower shook. Not much. This structure doesn't move easily, but I felt it through the dick against my whole body. 1 step, a pause, a second step. The tower shook again. I had my rifle. It was 6 inches from my right hand, and everything in me wanted to grab it. But the act of moving seemed in that moment like the thing that would get me killed. If he hadn't seen me yet, any movement I made might confirm my presence. Any sound. A third step. A fourth. The top of the ladder was 12 feet up. The current footsteps were about 8 feet off the ground. 4 more steps and he'd be able to see over the railing. I closed my eyes and made a decision about what I was going to do. Then the footsteps stopped. A long pause, longer than any pause had a right to be. Long enough that my sense of time completely broke down. And then, the sounds of impact. Someone jumping down from the ladder. And then the drag sound again, and the footsteps moving away. I lay on that deck for 10 full minutes. When I finally raised my head above the railing, the scrub brush was empty. The fence line was clear. Whatever had been there was gone. I should have called 911 from the tower and waited. I know that. I have known it every day since. Instead, I climbed down the ladder, turned on my pocket flashlight, which I recognized as potentially disastrous the moment I did it, and started walking home. I made it about 60 feet. The footsteps behind me were the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Not because they were actually loud, but because of what they meant. The complete collapse of my earlier theory that I'd been unseen, unfollowed, forgotten. He had been waiting. He had known exactly where I was going. I turned. He was right there. The distance between us in that moment was approximately the length of a parking space. His face was still in shadow under the hood. His arm was extended toward me. I fired, hit him in the shoulder. He stopped like he'd run into something solid, and the sound that came out of him, I won't describe it, but it is burned into my memory in a way that I suspect is permanent. In the second he was stopped and screaming, I turned and covered the remaining 340 feet to the back porch in a run that I don't fully remember making. I was inside and on the phone with 911 before I'd fully registered that I was safe. 14 minutes for the first unit to arrive. 31 minutes for the full search team. I led them through the property with 2 officers flanking me on either side. Headlamps, rifles. Professional calm that I was very grateful for. We found the drag trail first, then the bag, abandoned near the fence line where he dropped it when he ran. The officers secured and tagged it without opening it in front of me, which I understood and appreciated. Then the blood trail, dark against pale leaf litter, unmistakable, leading northeast out through the back fence and into the pine woods beyond. We found him 200 yards out, under a fallen pine. Jacket pressed against his shoulder, legs drawn up, very still. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He just looked up at the headlamps. The investigation took months. Details came out slowly, through formal channels, filtered and fragmented. I know that the bag contained evidence connected to the death of a man named Lin Park, a Vietnamese immigrant who had owned a small grocery store in a town 12 miles from my property. I know that the man who climbed my ladder that night has been convicted and is in a Texas state facility. I don't know why he chose my land. I don't know what he intended after he'd finished whatever he was doing on the property that night. Some questions don't get answers. What I know is that I was in the tower, that I was paying attention, that the decades my grandfather and father and I spent learning to sit still in the dark, to listen for what didn't belong, to trust the quiet signals, that all of that was worth exactly what it cost. The tower is still standing. I was out there last November, 2 nights after Thanksgiving, sitting in the padded seat my grandfather never got to see, cold enough to see my breath, hogs moving somewhere in the dark beyond the fence, everything the same, everything different. These 3 stories, Marcus in Tennessee, Jake in Montana, and Travis in Texas, represent something that no hunting safety course ever adequately covers. The wilderness isn't just dangerous because of the terrain or the weather or the animals. It's dangerous because it is, by definition, a place where human behavior operates outside of normal social guardrails. There are no witnesses. There are no cameras. There are no bystanders who might intervene. When you walk into the deep woods, you are relying, more completely than in almost any other setting in your life, on your own instincts and your own judgment. Marcus trusted his gut and got his son out. Jake screamed when his brain needed time to process, and that scream saved lives. Travis held his position and made the hardest decision of his life, and because of that, someone dangerous is no longer free. None of them did everything perfectly. All of them made mistakes in the moment. Marcus walking toward the stranger, Jake leaving the tent to play a prank, Travis using his flashlight in the dark. Hindsight is easy. What they all had in common is that they came home. That's not always guaranteed. That's never guaranteed. If you're heading into the backcountry this season, I want to leave you with the same thought that I come back to every time I read stories like these. Tell someone where you're going. Check in when you get back. Trust the thing in your gut that says something is wrong. The woods will always be there. Make sure you are too. Some nights when I read through the messages people send me, the hunters, the hikers, the campers, The people who live out near the tree lines of this enormous country, I'm struck by how many of them have a version of a story like these. An encounter they couldn't explain, a stranger who felt wrong, a sound that made the whole night go quiet. Most of them don't tell anyone. They tuck it away in the back of a drawer and let the daylight persuade them it wasn't as bad as it felt. That's a very human thing to do. But Marcus told his wife and called the sheriff. Jake filed a report and told me his story. Travis led a search team through his property and sat in court and let the whole thing become part of the public record. And now you know these stories too. The wilderness in this country is extraordinary, vast and ancient and full of beauty that can still, even now, take your breath away. I believe in it completely. I believe in the value of going out into it, of spending time in places where the world gets quiet and the sky gets big, and you are reminded, usefully, how small you are. I just also believe this: the wilderness is not safe. Not because of bears, not because of terrain, but because human beings sometimes do terrible things in remote places, specifically because remote places offer them a kind of cover that ordinary life doesn't. Tell someone where you're going. Come back when you said you would. Trust the thing in your gut that says something here is wrong. The woods will be there when you get back. Make sure you are too.